7 words broadcasted on a tactical radio frequency brought an entire American signals intelligence operation to a sudden, grinding halt for 43 agonizing minutes. The transmission originated from an Australian Special Air Service Regiment patrol operating deep within the hostile terrain 12 kilometers northeast of Tarankout. When an American crypto analyst flagged this highly unusual broadcast for immediate review, 3 separate intelligence analysts spent the better part of an hour trying to determine if the coalition frequency had been fatally compromised by enemy forces. The tension in the operations center was palpable and heavy. The seemingly innocuous phrase that triggered this massive security alert was simple enough in its construction, stating merely that she will be apples heading for the servo. Within the unique and often baffling lexicon of Australian tactical communication, this specific sentence meant the patrol was proceeding to the designated refueling point without any hostile incident. However, to the American signals, intelligence team diligently monitoring the coalition frequencies that crisp night in October 2007, it sounded like absolutely nothing they had ever encountered during their 14 months of continuous operations in the volatile Uruzgan province. Staff Sergeant Marcus Puit had spent 11 dedicated years in the United States Army, with the last 4 attached to the elite 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment. His primary responsibility involved coordinating highly complex communications support for top-tier military units operating across the unforgiving landscape of southern Afghanistan. He had systematically monitored Delta Force operations, worked closely alongside clandestine CIA ground branch teams, and expertly supported more than 200 critical combat missions in rugged terrain that routinely killed standard radios and satellite links with equal and ruthless indifference to human life. Marcus fundamentally understood tactical military communication the way a seasoned trauma surgeon intuitively understands human anatomy. He knew intimately every standardized abbreviation, mandatory brevity code, and every complex encrypted shorthand that kept American operators alive in treacherous valleys where a stray cellular phone signal could easily trigger hidden improvised explosive devices. His entire professional existence was built around the rigid, predictable architecture of modern technological warfare, where precision in language translated directly to survival on the battlefield. Any deviation from this established norm represented a potential catastrophe that could cost multiple lives. What Marcus simply did not understand, and what absolutely nobody in his Advanced Signals Operations Center could logically explain that tense October night, was the Australian element. He could not fathom why this Allied patrol had suddenly transmitted what appeared to be either a highly sophisticated coded message outside any known standard protocol, or worse, deliberate enemy disinformation designed specifically to create exactly the kind of widespread operational confusion now rapidly spreading through his center. The technological superiority of the American military seemed entirely useless in the face of this bizarre linguistic anomaly. The formal incident report that Marcus meticulously filed the following morning eventually ran to 4 highly detailed pages. It systematically documented not just the confusing transmission itself, but 17 completely separate instances over the preceding 6 weeks where Australian communications had generated significant issues. These baffling SASR broadcasts had directly caused operational confusion, dangerous logistical delays, or outright security alerts within the heavily structured American signals architecture. The pattern was undeniable, frustrating, and incredibly dangerous from the perspective of standard NATO operational doctrine that prioritized extreme clarity above all other communicative aspects. In one particularly stressful documented case, a reconnaissance patrol had abruptly reported being flat out like a lizard drinking during a critical movement phase. Marcus and his highly trained team immediately interpreted this bizarre animal reference as indicating a potential desperate contact with overwhelming enemy forces in the sector. They scrambled resources, only to discover hours later that the Australians were simply indicating they were moving at their maximum sustainable physical speed toward the objective. The massive expenditure of American analytical energy over a local colloquialism was both intensely embarrassing and operationally taxing. In another similarly chaotic incident, the casual transmission stating "no worries, just fossicking about" had instantly triggered a frantic 15-minute tactical analysis. The entire intelligence floor debated whether fossicking was a highly classified code word for a specific, undocumented reconnaissance protocol that they lacked the clearance to understand. It certainly was not. The Australian operators were merely describing their methodical search methodology in cultural terms that would have been immediately and perfectly understood by anyone who had grown up in Brisbane or Perth, completely bypassing the rigid structures of modern military terminology. To American ears fundamentally trained on years of rigidly standardized NATO terminology, these casual broadcasts sounded like chaotic transmissions originating from another war entirely. But the frustratingly obscure language itself was only the beginning of what Marcus found himself completely unable to logically explain or document. The deeper he systematically examined the overall Australian approach to tactical field communications, the more he encountered disturbing patterns that aggressively violated absolutely everything he deeply understood about modern special operations radio discipline. He felt as though he was witnessing a deliberate degradation of standard military science. The standard American approach to tactical communication had meticulously evolved through decades of massive technological investment and rigorous academic study. Every single operator in a standard Delta Force assault element carried advanced communications equipment that cost on average between $15,000 and $22,000. These systems included heavily encrypted radio networks with dedicated satellite backups, sophisticated Blue Force trackers that provided instantaneous real-time positioning to nervous command elements, and deeply redundant communication pathways. This ensured no single point of failure could ever sever the vital digital link between vulnerable operators on the ground. This massive technological architecture fundamentally required extremely strict adherence to universally standardized communicative protocols to function properly. Every single call sign spoken on the network logically followed carefully prescribed and rigid formats. Every tactical situation report rigorously used identical linguistic structures across every unit functioning in every global theater of war. The American system was undeniably magnificent in its breathtaking scope, comprehensively detailed in its coverage, and absolutely, fundamentally dependent on every single operator, perfectly speaking the exact same linguistic and procedural language without any trace of personal deviation or localized slang. The Australians, however, appeared to operate on an entirely different set of foundational assumptions that defied American logic. Their standard-issue tactical radios cost approximately 3,000 Australian dollars less than the heavily modified American equivalent systems used by Marcus. Furthermore, their bizarre communication protocols strongly reflected a unique tactical philosophy that Marcus found simultaneously maddening, incredibly unprofessional, and strangely fascinating. He could not simply ignore the glaring fact that despite their apparent lack of technological discipline, the Australian SASR units were achieving remarkably consistent operational success in highly dangerous combat environments. Where established American military doctrine heavily emphasized strict standardization to ensure seamless interoperability across a massive global force structure, the Australians pivoted. Australian SASR doctrine deliberately emphasized what one recently declassified, highly restricted training document officially described as communicative ambiguity functioning directly as operational security. Marcus stared at this concept in his office for hours, struggling to reconcile his rigid training with this dangerously unorthodox methodology. The very idea that deliberately confusing your own allies could somehow be considered a valid tactical advantage completely short-circuited his highly structured, digitally focused military mindset. The lingering question that kept Marcus awake in the early hours of the morning was whether this was truly a stroke of tactical genius or simply reckless cultural arrogance. He began compiling a secret dossier of every intercepted Australian transmission, mapping out their slang against successful mission outcomes in the perilous Uruzgan valleys. The correlation was terrifyingly consistent, suggesting that the most technologically advanced military in human history might have fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of secure communication in the modern battle space. He knew he had to confront them directly about this dangerous anomaly. Marcus began running complex statistical models on the SASR communication logs during his rare moments of downtime in the dimly lit operations center. He discovered that the average length of an Australian tactical transmission was a mere fraction of the standard American equivalent. While a heavily equipped U.S. Ranger squad would systematically broadcast a meticulous 90-second situation report detailing every possible operational metric, the Australians would often compress their entire battlefield update into less than 5 seconds of casual, almost indecipherable slang. This drastic reduction in electronic signature time was mathematically profound and deeply troubling. In an incredibly hostile environment where advanced enemy signals intelligence capabilities were sophisticated enough to rapidly locate transmitting radios within a matter of mere minutes, time was literally survival. Those crucial 85 seconds of reduced electronic exposure actively represented an incredibly meaningful tactical advantage that no amount of American encrypted technology could simply replicate. Yet Marcus's initial highly trained reaction was absolutely not one of professional appreciation or tactical awe. His visceral, immediate reaction was that these reckless individuals were inevitably going to get themselves violently killed through an arrogant inability to communicate properly. He imagined a catastrophic scenario where a small, isolated Australian patrol found themselves suddenly pinned down by overwhelming enemy fire in a remote mountain pass. In that desperate moment of survival, their bizarre slang would inevitably cause fatal delays as confused American air support desperately tried to translate their casual banter into actionable targeting coordinates. Marcus felt a heavy personal responsibility to prevent this entirely predictable tragedy from occurring on his operational watch. He decided to formally challenge their methodology, meticulously gathering undeniable evidence to prove that their communicative ambiguity was a massive vulnerability. The immense cultural divide between the two Allied military forces became increasingly apparent with every new intercepted radio transmission. The Americans fought their war bathed in the comforting glow of high-resolution satellite imagery, continuous digital data streams, and massive logistical superiority that sought to completely dominate the physical environment. The Australians, conversely, seemed entirely comfortable fading quietly into the harsh, unforgiving landscape, utilizing their localized language as a psychological camouflage that effectively blinded both their enemies and their friends. They were playing a completely different, ancient game of survival while wearing modern uniforms. Every time an American commander demanded a perfectly formatted update on friendly troop locations, the system reinforced its own desperate need for total control. Marcus realized that the American military machine was fundamentally terrified of the unknown, frantically using billions of dollars in communication technology to artificially illuminate the inherently chaotic darkness of war. The Australian silence, periodically punctuated by their brief, confusing slang, was a direct rejection of this need for absolute control. It was an embrace of the operational shadows that deeply unsettled the American intelligence analysts who watched the screens. As Marcus finalized his comprehensive report detailing the critical dangers of the Australian methodology, he felt a strange, creeping sensation of doubt settling in his gut. He looked at the flawless American digital communication architecture, a beautiful but incredibly fragile system that demanded absolute perfection to function safely. Then he looked at the messy, chaotic, deeply human reality of the Australian radio logs. A profound realization began to slowly take root in his analytical mind, whispering that perhaps the ultimate technological solution to modern warfare was to simply stop relying on the technology altogether. The physical environment at Forward Operating Base Tarin Kowt offered absolutely no comfort to anyone stationed within its heavily fortified perimeter. Dust permeated every crevice of the command tents, and the ambient temperature routinely tested the physical endurance of the communication equipment. Staff Sergeant Marcus Puit sat across from an Australian major in a small, poorly ventilated briefing room. The coffee resting between them on the scratched wooden table was terrible. Tasting faintly of burnt plastic and old aluminum, Marcus had meticulously prepared a heavily documented presentation specifically designed to force a fundamental change in their operational behavior. Marcus methodically spread his carefully printed spreadsheets across the table, ensuring the operational data was completely visible to the Australian officer. He clearly outlined the 17 specific communication incidents, the dangerous tactical delays they had directly caused, and his formal recommendations. He demanded the immediate and strict Australian adoption of standardized coalition terminology for all future combat operations. His tone remained perfectly professional, but the underlying frustration built up over months of monitoring chaotic radio traffic was impossible to completely hide from a seasoned combat veteran. He expected immediate compliance based on the sheer weight of his evidence. The seasoned Australian major, whose uniform bore the faded marks of countless combat deployments, listened to the Americans' grievances with practiced patience. He leaned back slowly in a cheap plastic chair that audibly protested the movement, nodding at all the appropriate intervals while Marcus passionately defended standard NATO protocols. The major did not interrupt, offering no defensive excuses for his operators' seemingly erratic behavior on the coalition frequencies. Instead, he waited until Marcus had completely exhausted his arguments before asking a single, piercing question that the American signals expert would violently remember for many years afterward. Looking directly into the American's eyes, the major casually asked, "Mate, how many of your standardized transmissions in the last month have been intercepted and exploited by enemy signals intelligence?" Marcus froze, immediately realizing he absolutely did not know the specific answer to that critical tactical question. The issue had never once been framed to him in those stark, operational terms during his extensive military training. American communication security was routinely handled at strategic levels far above his security access, compartmentalized away from the tactical operators who actually relied on those encrypted networks to stay alive. The dangerous assumption deeply embedded in every single NATO protocol Marcus diligently followed was that advanced digital encryption made the actual content of all transmissions inherently secure. The prevailing American doctrine completely ignored the severe physical risks associated with the length or frequency of the radio broadcasts themselves. The system blindly trusted the complex mathematical algorithms protecting the voice data, entirely forgetting that the sheer act of emitting a powerful electromagnetic signal instantly created a visible beacon in the dark. They were successfully hiding the specific message while loudly advertising the exact location of the terrified messenger. The Australian major smiled quietly, and while it was definitely not an unkind or mocking expression, it carried a massive emotional weight that Marcus felt immediately in his chest. The major calmly explained that they had brutally lost 4 good men in East Timor because someone had talked entirely too long on a tactical radio that was supposedly completely secure. He stated clearly that while the digital encryption had worked perfectly, the enemy's primitive direction-finding equipment had not cared about the encryption at all. The tragic lesson was paid for in blood and forever changed their operational doctrine. Continuing his grim explanation, the major described how the enemy forces had successfully triangulated the isolated patrol's exact physical position in under 3 minutes. They subsequently dropped heavy mortar rounds accurately on that precise location for the next terrifying hour, annihilating the unit. The major firmly stated, "Since then, we have operated on one absolute foundational principle. Every single second of active radio transmission is a second the enemy is actively looking for you." He locked eyes with Marcus, ensuring the young American fully understood the deadly physics of electronic warfare that superseded any advanced cryptographic software. The Australian officer deliberately leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly as he delivered the core philosophy that drove Marcus absolutely crazy. He explained that if their own highly trained allies could not immediately understand their rapid transmissions, then neither could the hostile enemy intelligence officers monitoring those exact same frequencies. He emphatically declared, "If they cannot understand what you are saying even when they clearly hear it, that is definitely not a systemic bug. That is exactly the point." Marcus felt a sudden cold realization wash over him as the tactical brilliance of this bizarre methodology finally crystallized. Reaching slowly into the cargo pocket of his faded desert uniform, the major pulled out a small, heavily laminated rectangular card. It was visibly worn at the sharp edges, clearly having been carried faithfully through multiple dangerous combat deployments across hostile environments. He placed it carefully on the table between them, proudly stating it contained what the regiment affectionately called the Bush Telegraph. It was a comprehensive, meticulously curated list of approximately 40 distinct phrases rooted entirely in obscure Australian cultural slang, neatly paired with their highly specific tactical equivalents for immediate battlefield deployment and operational execution. Marcus leaned in to closely examine the strange document that had caused him so much professional grief over the past months. He read that flat chat officially meant maintaining maximum operational tempo during an assault. Gone walkabout cleanly indicated a high-value target's sudden departure from a designated observation zone. The phrase, "she is apples," positively confirmed a dangerous mission was proceeding exactly as planned. Fury urgently warned friendly forces of suspected enemy disinformation. Yakatime silently signaled the imminent, violent action phase of a coordinated ambush. The vocabulary was entirely alien to standard military operational science. Looking up from the worn card, Marcus stated aloud that they had deliberately and systematically created a completely parallel communication protocol outside the sanctioned NATO architecture. It was not quite a question, but rather a stunned professional acknowledgement of a brilliantly subversive tactical reality. He finally understood that the frustrating localized slang was not born from reckless cultural arrogance or a lack of proper military discipline. It was actually a highly sophisticated, deeply layered defense mechanism specifically engineered to exploit the fundamental weaknesses of modern electronic warfare while successfully maintaining critical operational flexibility in the darkest shadows. The Major nodded slowly, formally confirming that they had deliberately created a unique language designed specifically to achieve three critical operational goals simultaneously. He carefully explained that this methodology drastically shortens dangerous transmission exposure time, completely confuses anyone hostile who manages to intercept the signal, and deeply builds vital unit cohesion. He noted that every single operator implicitly knows that when the soldier next to him casually says no dramas, he is absolutely not just being informal. He is officially confirming that the current chaotic battlefield situation perfectly matches their rigorous training and their established tactical plan. Elaborating on the psychological aspect, the Australian commander described their localized slang as a vital, perfectly functioning battlefield shibboleth. He firmly stated that if a voice on the chaotic radio network does not instinctively know exactly what the obscure cultural phrase means, they are absolutely not a trusted member of the elite unit. It provided an instantaneous, incredibly reliable biometric verification of identity that required zero digital processing power or complex cryptographic handshakes. The slang functioned as an unbreakable cultural firewall, effortlessly protecting the patrol from sophisticated enemy impersonation tactics that routinely plagued conventional military communication networks. Marcus sat silently in the suffocating heat of the briefing room, desperately trying to intellectually process this massive paradigm shift. The initial anger and deep professional frustration that had originally driven him to schedule this tense meeting were rapidly evaporating, replaced by a genuine, profound, tactical curiosity. He was slowly beginning to realize that these rough men might actually be operating on a significantly higher, incredibly advanced intellectual plane regarding modern survival. They had effectively weaponized their own unique cultural identity, turning localized civilian linguistic quirks into a highly lethal, completely untraceable military asset on the battlefield. Recognizing the Americans' sudden shift from dismissive hostility to genuine professional intrigue, the Major unexpectedly offered a remarkably rare invitation. He officially agreed to allow Marcus temporary embedded observation status during an upcoming, highly classified SASR tactical training exercise. This was a completely unprecedented opportunity, uniquely extended, partly because Marcus's initial technical questions had remained strictly professional rather than arrogantly dismissive. It was also offered partly because the battle-hardened Australians operated with an overwhelming technologically dependent coalition military partners. The rigorous parameters of the upcoming field exercise involved a grueling 72-hour continuous surveillance patrol moving silently through harsh terrain. The chosen training environment perfectly replicated the brutal, unforgiving operational conditions routinely found in northeastern Uruzgan province. 12 elite Australian operators were strategically divided into 3 completely separate reconnaissance patrols, each assigned uniquely complex tactical objectives. This challenging mission profile would absolutely require precise, synchronized coordination despite maintaining a significant geographic separation of up to 8 kilometers between the small, isolated teams. It was designed to push their communication methodologies to the absolute breaking point. Marcus knew exactly how a comparable American Special Operations Unit would typically handle this specific geographic separation and tactical isolation. Standard U.S. military doctrine would absolutely demand constant, uninterrupted digital communication, requiring detailed situational updates every 30 minutes without fail. The operators would be forced to transmit precise GPS position confirmations every single hour, feeding a massive, hungry command network that desperately maintained continuous, real-time awareness of every friendly element's exact location. The American approach fundamentally prioritized overwhelming command visibility and absolute centralized control over the severe operational risks associated with constant electromagnetic signal emissions. Monitoring the training exercise from a secure observation post, Marcus witnessed a shocking reality that completely shattered his previous operational assumptions. Over the entire brutal 72-hour duration of the grueling field operation, the 3 isolated Australian patrols transmitted a grand total of exactly 17 times. There were absolutely no hourly digital check-ins, no desperate requests for detailed instructions, and absolutely no unnecessary chatter clogging the silent tactical frequencies. They moved like silent ghosts through the rugged landscape, completely disconnected from the comforting digital tether that American forces considered absolutely essential for basic battlefield survival and tactical coordination. When the grueling exercise finally concluded, Marcus meticulously calculated the data and found himself staring in absolute disbelief at the final numbers. The total combined radio airtime for all three Australian elements across the entire three-day operation was an astonishingly brief 63 seconds. He found himself obsessively returning to that impossible number repeatedly over the following tense weeks. He furiously compared it to his own detailed records, noting with a heavy heart that his highly trained American teams transmitted an average of 412 distinct times during comparable long-range reconnaissance operations in the exact same terrain. The cold, hard mathematics of the situation aggressively suggested a terrifying operational truth that Marcus was not yet fully prepared to accept. 63 seconds of total electromagnetic exposure essentially rendered the Australian operators completely invisible to even the most sophisticated enemy signals intelligence capabilities in the region. Conversely, the hundreds of mandatory American digital transmissions acted like a massive blinding spotlight, continuously announcing their exact tactical movements to anyone possessing basic scanning equipment. The sophisticated technological infrastructure that Marcus had proudly dedicated his entire professional military career to building and maintaining suddenly looked like a massive, fatal liability. Returning alone to his massive, air-conditioned operations center, Marcus looked at the glowing screens displaying hundreds of active digital tracks. Every single blue icon representing an American unit was constantly broadcasting its location, desperately screaming its existence into the hostile electronic void. He finally understood the heavy burden the Australian major carried, knowing that technological arrogance eventually leads directly to devastating battlefield casualties. The profound lessons of the Bush Telegraph and the 63-second doctrine completely rewired Marcus's understanding of secure communications, violently replacing his absolute faith in complex encryption algorithms with a deep, primal respect for absolute silence. This dramatic intellectual awakening fundamentally prepared Marcus for the catastrophic events that would unfold during the bloody third week of September. Coalition intelligence would soon identify a massive high-value target, actively moving through the deeply hostile and geographically complex Chora Valley. This impending high-stakes combat operation would force the technologically dependent American quick reaction forces to work directly alongside the silent, invisible Australian operators under incredibly dangerous real-world conditions. It would become the ultimate, undeniable crucible, brutally testing whether the ancient discipline of silence could actually defeat an enemy that actively hunted by listening to the modern digital noise. The real test of this bizarre communicative philosophy finally materialized during the unforgiving third week of September. Coalition military intelligence successfully identified a massive, highly elusive, high-value target actively moving through the treacherous terrain of the Chora Valley. This dangerous individual, officially designated as Objective Falcon in classified briefing documents, had been directly responsible for coordinating devastating improvised explosive device networks across 3 separate provinces. Previous American military attempts to aggressively interdict this specific commander had unfortunately failed spectacularly, costing millions and yielding absolutely no actionable results for the frustrated coalition forces attempting to secure the volatile region. In one particularly disastrous previous operation, a heavily armed Delta Force element had unfortunately compromised their hidden surveillance position 47 hours into a critical mission. Their massive helicopter resupply flight was easily spotted by local civilian shepherds tending their scattered flocks in the high mountains. A subsequent multi-million-dollar drone strike had completely destroyed an empty mud compound exactly 6 hours after the elusive target had quietly departed the immediate area. The total cost of these embarrassing failed tactical operations heavily exceeded $3 million, creating immense political pressure on Marcus to finally secure a decisive battlefield victory. Marcus received official authorization to coordinate a complex joint operational approach to finally eliminate Objective Falcon. The exact same 12 Australian operators who had successfully completed the earlier, deeply frustrating surveillance exercise would secretly establish hidden observation positions deep within the valley. Meanwhile, heavily armed American assets would intentionally remain safely distant, ready to seamlessly provide overwhelming quick reaction capability and devastating aerial fire support upon request. The strategic operation absolutely seemed incredibly straightforward and perfectly logical on paper, representing the ideal synergy between silent Allied reconnaissance capabilities and massive American destructive combat power waiting in the dark. Marcus had personally conducted dozens of highly similar combat missions throughout his extensive military career in the Middle East. He fundamentally understood the rigid, comforting rhythm of modern American warfare, perfectly visualizing the standard operational sequence of inserting troops, observing the target, confirming identity, striking with absolute precision, and extracting safely. It was designed to be perfectly clean, incredibly efficient, and distinctly American in its overwhelming execution. What he completely failed to grasp was that the brutal Kora Valley in late September naturally presented severe environmental conditions his advanced technological training had simply never addressed or properly simulated. The staggering physical temperature differential between the scorching day and the freezing night constantly exceeded 31 degrees Celsius in the exposed valley. The brutal daytime peaks easily reached 47 degrees in completely exposed rocky positions, actively threatening severe heat stroke. Consequently, nighttime lows rapidly dropped down to 16 degrees, causing sudden violent shivering among stationary personnel. This massive, rapid thermal swing naturally created bizarre atmospheric thermal currents that effectively rendered standard military night vision equipment completely unreliable and essentially useless for the critical first 90 minutes immediately following the setting sun, blinding the technologically dependent Allied surveillance elements. Furthermore, the treacherous valley floor fundamentally consisted of an incredibly fine, powdery particulate dust that violently swirled with the slightest gentle breeze. This highly abrasive material inevitably coated delicate digital optical systems and complex camera lenses within mere hours of physical exposure to the harsh environment. Additionally, the unpredictable local population pattern strongly meant that any hidden military position established within basic observation range of likely enemy travel routes would naturally experience civilian foot traffic within 50 meters at highly unpredictable intervals. Innocent farmers and curious children constantly moved through the exact areas needed for covert military observation. The seasoned Australian patrol commander, known to the American command network only by his highly classified call sign November 6, formally requested a detailed planning session immediately before the scheduled insertion. Marcus readily agreed to this mandatory meeting, confidently expecting the usual rigorous tactical coordination regarding encrypted radio frequencies, specific emergency code words, designated helicopter extraction points, and complex artillery fire support protocols. Instead of referencing massive digital intelligence files, November 6 simply produced a heavily worn, deeply creased hand-drawn paper map systematically showing 17 potential hidden observation sites meticulously plotted across the unforgiving physical landscape. This primitive physical document was carefully annotated with complex estimated compromise probabilities, specifically based entirely on local agricultural movement patterns. His dedicated team had quietly observed during previous combat, rotation, while Marcus's advanced American teams rigidly used multi-million-dollar satellite imagery and highly classified signals intelligence to blindly select standard observation positions. The Australians apparently utilized deep, intimate knowledge of exactly when poor local farmers typically took their daily lunch breaks under the burning sun. This stark, glaring contrast in basic operational methodology absolutely highlighted the massive philosophical gap separating the two fundamentally different Allied military forces. The highly dangerous stealth insertion officially occurred under the dark cover of night on September 19th. Advanced American combat helicopters silently delivered both military elements to separate completely unlit landing zones, approximately 8 kilometers apart in the treacherous mountains. Marcus intensely monitored the complex operation from a heavily fortified command post located at Forward Operating Base Anaconda, where dozens of glowing monitors proudly displayed live drone feeds, active digital communications logs, and exact real-time physical position tracking data for the heavily armed American Quick Reaction Force currently standing by. He felt completely in control of the situation. Shockingly, the advanced digital tracking transponders strictly assigned to the elite Australian team deliberately went completely dark, a mere 4 minutes after their boots physically hit the dusty landing zone. This sudden, alarming disappearance from the digital grid was entirely intentional and completely approved. November 6 had previously explained calmly that constant electronic data emissions naturally created highly detectable invisible signatures that sophisticated enemy intelligence adversaries could easily track and actively exploit for targeted ambushes, while Marcus's strict NATO protocols demanded continuous real-time physical position awareness of all friendly elements. The Australians willingly embraced total electronic darkness. For the incredibly agonizing first 18 hours of the critical surveillance mission, Marcus nervously received exactly 2 brief digital transmissions from the hidden Australian element. The first encrypted message, secretly sent at exactly 3:17 in the morning on September 20th, simply consisted of 4 basic words confirming their position was successfully established, and they were continuing the vital mission. The second highly compressed burst, arriving exactly 12 agonizing hours later, firmly confirmed positive visual observation of enemy vehicle movement, completely consistent with the elusive target's known historical travel pattern through the treacherous dust of the valley. Both of these crucial, highly encrypted radio transmissions lasted significantly under 5 total seconds in actual broadcast duration. Both were effectively encrypted using a bizarre, outdated mathematical system that Marcus's highly trained signals analysts nervously noted was at least 2 full generations older than the currently mandated American security standard. Meanwhile, the heavily armed American Quick Reaction Force actively conducted 3 massive, incredibly loud tactical rehearsals of their planned assault sequence. Each violent physical rehearsal absolutely required massive coordination flights that consumed thousands of gallons of aviation fuel and generated massive, highly visible electronic warning signatures. The horrifying real test of this massive operational disconnect violently arrived early on the tense morning of September 21st. A nervous local village elder, known traditionally as a Melek, suddenly arrived at a heavily fortified coalition security checkpoint near the valley's dusty eastern entrance. He urgently reported observing highly unusual, extremely suspicious enemy activity in his small village. His terrifying information, slowly filtered through nervous civilian interpreters and complex military intelligence channels, finally reached Marcus's cluttered desk at approximately 0945. The elder explicitly claimed that unknown armed strangers had been aggressively asking specific questions about Americans. The frightened village elder strongly suggested that someone deeply embedded within the hostile enemy network was already acutely aware of renewed coalition military interest in the immediate area. This terrifying, highly credible human intelligence should have instantly triggered an immediate, mandatory tactical reassessment of the entire operation. Under Marcus's rigid American security protocols, absolutely any unconfirmed indication of potential operational compromise formally required a massive, immediate mission abort and the rapid physical extraction of all deployed coalition elements. The calculated risk matrix was mathematically clear. The entire valley could easily be an elaborate, heavily armed, deadly trap. If the sophisticated adversary actually suspected ongoing covert military surveillance, any high-value target suddenly appearing in the designated observation zone might simply be a deliberate, highly dangerous tactical lure. Marcus immediately ordered the heavily armed American Quick Reaction Force to stand down indefinitely pending a massive intelligence analysis. He frantically attempted to securely contact the hidden Australian element to urgently relay the terrifying warning. The desperate digital transmission went completely unanswered, swallowed by the silent valley. For the next 6 terrifying hours, Marcus experienced a brutal state of controlled panic as absolute silence fundamentally dominated the chaotic situation. Standard procedure dictated that uncontactable military elements must be officially presumed compromised, requiring immediate, massive recovery operations. Marcus did not initiate these rescue protocols, fundamentally unable to logically explain this dangerous hesitation even to himself. At approximately 1500 hours local time, a small convoy of 3 dusty vehicles slowly entered the Chora Valley from the western approach. Advanced drone surveillance instantly identified the lead vehicle as perfectly matching the specific travel pattern deeply associated with Objective Falcon's previous lethal movements. The deadly game had finally begun. Marcus watched in utter dread as the convoy proceeded directly toward the center of the valley, passing within exactly 400 meters of the Australian team's last reported operational area. The vehicles abruptly stopped. Heavily armed men quickly emerged, appearing to be aggressively conducting a meticulous security sweep. Moving in highly coordinated patterns that strongly suggested professional military training, They systematically checked abandoned buildings, examined key terrain features, and violently questioned terrified local lads who appeared at their approach. The terrifying sweep continued relentlessly for 47 agonizing minutes. During this incredibly tense and exhaustive physical search, the small Australian patrol miraculously remained completely invisible to the naked eye. They were absolutely not merely undetected. They were completely erased from the harsh physical environment. Marcus's highly trained drone operators frantically searched the specific grid, desperately utilizing advanced thermal sensors and sophisticated signals intelligence, but found absolutely nothing. 12 living, breathing human beings occupied precise tactical positions somewhere in that small valley, completely bypassing the billion-dollar surveillance technology of the most advanced military force in human history. The grueling physical sweep finally concluded when the target's dedicated security element apparently satisfied itself that the dusty area was completely clear of coalition forces. The convoy confidently resumed its cautious movement toward a fortified mud compound that military intelligence had previously identified as a probable meeting location. Marcus's glowing screens clearly showed the dusty vehicles slowly approaching the target building. His heavily armed quick reaction force remained frozen on standby, desperately awaiting explicit assault orders. The operational situation had severely degraded into absolute chaos and terrifying uncertainty. Suddenly, the encrypted radio on Marcus's cluttered desk crackled to life, violently breaking the agonizing 6 hours of absolute silence. The highly compressed digital transmission lasted exactly 11 seconds. The voice of November 6 was perfectly calm and completely unhurried, cleanly delivering a precise tactical situation report that instantly made Marcus's previous terrifying uncertainty entirely irrelevant. The supposedly lost Australian team had secretly observed the entire meticulous security sweep from 3 separate, perfectly concealed positions without ever triggering a single enemy alarm or alerting the advanced American sensors above. November 6 clinically reported that his silent operators had successfully identified 5 additional heavily armed enemy fighters who had arrived quietly on foot. These insurgents had utilized concealed ravines, completely evading the massive American drone coverage constantly circling above the valley. The hidden Australians had effortlessly mapped out every single guard position, building entry point, and specific vehicle placement in real time. They had miraculously accomplished this monumental intelligence gathering while remaining entirely undetected by a highly professional counter-surveillance team actively hunting for people exactly like them. The incredibly vital operational information that November 6 calmly provided in those brief 11 seconds vastly exceeded what Marcus's massive military intelligence apparatus had painstakingly developed over 3 weeks of rigorous preparation. However, the truly terrifying and destabilizing psychological moment for the American commander was yet to come. November 6 casually mentioned a specific, chilling detail regarding the recent security sweep that completely shattered Marcus's foundational understanding of human physical endurance. One of the hostile fighters had unknowingly approached within 7 meters of a primary Australian hide site. The heavily concealed Australian operator, later identified in highly classified after-action reports simply as the forward observer, was forced to make an incredibly dangerous choice. He had remained absolutely motionless, completely suppressing all natural human physiological responses for 31 agonizing minutes while the heavily armed insurgent meticulously conducted his visual search. The terrifying reality was that the enemy fighter had actually sat down to physically rest on the exact rocky formation that effectively concealed the incredibly vulnerable observer's shallow position. The physical proximity was dangerously, lethally close. While resting casually on those very rocks, the completely oblivious Taliban fighter slowly smoked a local cigarette, allowing the pungent smell of burning cheap tobacco to drift directly into the hidden soldier's face. The insurgent even casually urinated against the warm stones before finally departing the immediate area. Throughout this entire horrifying ordeal, the enemy displayed absolutely no indication that he suspected a living, breathing human presence existed within mere arm's reach. The sheer mental discipline required to endure this intimate threat without flinching was absolutely terrifying to contemplate. Marcus had personally trained countless elite military operators in advanced camouflage and modern concealment techniques throughout his extensive special operations career. He had witnessed firsthand the absolute best that highly motivated American soldiers could possibly achieve under strictly controlled training conditions. Yet, he had never read or heard of anything remotely approaching the seemingly superhuman physical discipline that this incredibly brief radio transmission casually described as a standard operational outcome. The Australians were fundamentally operating on an entirely different psychological plane that modern technology simply could not replicate. Armed with this incredibly precise, meticulously gathered, real-time intelligence, the heavily armed American Quick Reaction Force finally launched their massive aerial assault on the compound. The subsequent violent execution was absolutely flawless and overwhelmingly decisive. Objective Falcon was successfully captured alive, alongside 4 key terrorist associates and a massive trove of highly actionable documentary evidence. This spectacular joint raid would effectively dismantle the entire regional improvised explosive device network for several years, saving countless coalition lives and validating the extreme risk taken by the silent reconnaissance team. In the quiet, exhausted aftermath of the highly successful military raid, Marcus sat alone in his dimly lit command center, profoundly shaken by a sudden, chilling tactical realization. The truth violently crystallized in his mind during his mandated post-operation analysis. If he had actually managed to contact the hidden Australian team to deliver his earlier panicked warning, the sudden electromagnetic radio signature would have instantly compromised their vulnerable physical position during the enemy's incredibly meticulous security sweep, inevitably leading to a catastrophic and entirely avoidable slaughter. Furthermore, if their advanced digital transponders had somehow remained actively broadcasting according to the incredibly strict American operational protocols, those constant electronic emissions would have undoubtedly triggered the sophisticated enemy sensors. The Australians miraculously survived that deadly afternoon precisely because they intentionally and systematically violated absolutely every single technological principle that Marcus had been rigorously trained to enforce. Their brilliant survival fundamentally required the total rejection of the billion-dollar safety nets that the American military-industrial complex considered absolutely essential for operating safely in modern combat environments. Marcus finally understood the terrifying, unvarnished truth about the actual nature of modern asymmetric warfare. Writing quietly in his classified personal journal late that night, he penned a profoundly dark realization that would forever haunt his professional military career. He wrote, "We meticulously trained our American soldiers to constantly stay digitally connected to the command structure. They brutally trained themselves to simply stay alive in the dirt. These are absolutely not the same objective." This single profound thought completely redefined his entire understanding of actual combat survival. This historic Cora Valley operation brutally revealed a much deeper, darker methodology lurking beneath the surface of the Australian tactical approach. What Marcus intimately witnessed in the following tense weeks strongly suggested that the Australian operational mindset extended far beyond simple tactical patience and rigid communications discipline. They had deliberately engineered a psychological capability that allowed normal men to become completely invisible predators. However, Marcus also began to quietly wonder about the devastating biological and psychological toll such extreme physical suppression would inevitably demand from these silent soldiers. The true cost of what Marcus Stafford witnessed in the harsh Cora Valley would not become entirely clear until many years later. It was only when clinical medical reports began officially surfacing from veteran hospitals that the devastating psychological reality emerged. The Veteran Support Network quietly started publishing alarming casualty numbers that no classified operational briefing had ever dared to mention. By the year 2014, the average Australian Special Operations soldier had completed a staggering 10.3 combat rotations through the brutal and unforgiving Afghan theater. Some elite Australian patrol commanders had unbelievably deployed to the violent war zone 15 separate times during their military careers. In stark contrast, the standard American average across all highly trained special operations units was merely 4.7 combat rotations. Even the elite Delta Force operators, widely considered the most combat-experienced American counterparts, averaged only 6.1 deployments. This massive statistical gap fundamentally represented not just additional traumatic combat exposure, but a completely different, deeply disturbing relationship with sustained, extreme violence and psychological suppression. Marcus first acutely noticed this deeply unsettling psychological alteration during a routine joint planning session in Tarin Kowt in late 2010. A highly decorated Australian patrol commander sat quietly across from him, methodically working through complex ingress routes with a red pencil. The seasoned operator's cold eyes absolutely never stopped, frantically moving, constantly scanning the room's exits and tracking every single person entering. He was continuously cataloging invisible threat vectors in a secure space that military police had already thoroughly swept 3 times. When Marcus casually asked about this deeply paranoid physical behavior later that evening, an Allied liaison officer calmly explained the terrifying reality. He simply stated that the man had been fighting in these brutal mountains for 9 grueling years, and his traumatized brain fundamentally did not know how to turn off anymore. The Australian military's own highly classified internal medical assessments, portions of which were reluctantly declassified in 2019, officially documented what military psychiatrists clinically termed adaptive hypervigilance syndrome among their elite combat personnel. These silent operators, who had successfully mastered the brutal art of remaining completely motionless for 40 hours, inevitably developed abnormal neurological patterns. These severe psychological alterations persistently haunted them long after their final combat deployment had ended. Rigorous sleep studies conducted at a major military hospital showed that returned personnel experienced rapid eye movement interruption rates vastly higher than standard infantry veterans. Their traumatized brains had been permanently trained to violently wake at the absolute slightest environmental anomaly, and this brutal conditioning simply refused to reverse itself. What Marcus had historically called the 1,000-yard stare was absolutely not a new phenomenon to the terrible history of human warfare. However, its specific clinical manifestation within these silent Australian operators carried a distinctly different, far more sinister quality. These were definitely not weak men who had been suddenly broken by a single catastrophic battlefield event. They were highly resilient men who had been methodically and deliberately shaped by years of operating in dark spaces where human cognition was intentionally pushed far beyond its natural biological limits. A senior military psychologist formerly attached to the Special Operations Command brilliantly described this tragic phenomenon in stark clinical terms. She noted with profound sadness that the rigorous military selection process successfully identified aggressive men whose natural stress responses could be trained completely below the conscious threshold. She stated, "We created perfect, silent predators, and then we spent years proudly proving our lethal theories were absolutely right. What we totally failed to adequately model was what actually happens when you return that nervous system to civilian society." This terrifying psychological gray zone unfortunately extended far beyond individual mental trauma into deeply troubling operational territory that generated massive public inquiries. Between 2005 and 2016, elite Australian military personnel were directly involved in numerous horrific incidents that triggered formal criminal reviews. The infamous Brereton Report officially documented highly credible evidence of unlawful killings and recommended severe criminal prosecutions for multiple decorated personnel. Marcus learned of these dark allegations through secure intelligence channels long before the massive scandal reached the horrified civilian public. His conflicted emotional reaction was permanently recorded in a highly classified email sent directly to his commanding officer regarding the shocking investigations. He desperately wrote, "These are the exact same brave men who physically showed us what was tactically possible in the darkest valleys. I honestly do not know how to ever reconcile the magnificent things they achieved with the terrible things they may have done." The unbelievable operational effectiveness of the silent methodology remained absolutely undeniable, even as the horrific moral cost became painfully visible. Captured Taliban commanders constantly identified these specific Australian patrols as their absolute primary operational concern throughout the long war. A former insurgent subcommander, speaking through an exhausted interpreter from a cold prison cell in Kabul, provided the ultimate terrifying assessment. He stated clinically that the heavily armed Americans always came with loud helicopters, allowing his hidden fighters to easily hear them 30 minutes before they arrived. However, the silent Australians were simply already there waiting in the shadows long before the insurgents ever knew to look. During his final interrogation session, this defeated insurgent commander used a single terrifying term spoken in broken English to describe his ultimate fear. He whispered about the bearded ones, explicitly clarifying he did not mean the Americans with their massive satellites or loud aircraft. He deeply feared the silent men who grew long beards to seamlessly blend into local populations who appeared like violent ghosts from barren terrain and who strangely communicated in a bizarre language that sounded exactly like random static, even when perfectly intercepted. Marcus's final intelligence report contained one desperate recommendation that the American military establishment completely rejected due to its supposed operational complexity. He unsuccessfully proposed the mandatory integration of localized linguistic confusion protocols into standard special operations training. Today, the heavily armed Taliban confidently controls Afghanistan once again, while expensive American satellites orbit uselessly above. Yet, somewhere in the harsh deserts of Western Australia, a new generation of silent operators continues training, mastering the ancient slang, and preparing to survive in dark spaces where modern technology absolutely cannot reach.